Imagine being born 800 years ago. If you tried to explain the concept of a date to someone from the 10th century, they simply wouldn't understand. The idea of two people meeting at a cafe, strolling through a park, and getting to know each other to see if they are compatible for life together didn't exist. In fact, such behavior would have been deemed dangerous, inappropriate, and likely illegal. We often think of finding a partner as a personal drama or a romantic adventure. Today, it's a tale of two halves searching for one another in a vast world. However, in the Middle Ages, a person was never just a half. They were part of a rigid structure, a clan, a guild, or a community. Marriage wasn't about the union of two loving hearts. It was more like a merger of two corporations. This applied to everyone, from kings who married to annex provinces to peasants who gained neighbouring fields or grazing rights through marriage. The model we're familiar with, where feelings come first and practicality follows, would have seemed insane to someone from that era. Relying on emotions that could ignite today and fade tomorrow when forming a union that determined the survival of your children and elders was seen as sheer folly. Marriage was the cornerstone of economic security, a contract for survival. In a world without pensions, insurance, or social guarantees, family was the only safety net. Thus, choosing a partner was too significant a matter to leave to young people whose heads were clouded by hormones. The very fabric of medieval life was hostile to privacy. The idea of seclusion necessary for a romantic date raised suspicion. If two people of different genders sought to be alone, it was assumed they were plotting something sinful. A respectable person lived in plain sight. In villages, everything was visible to neighbours, and in castles, life unfolded in vast common halls filled with servants, relatives, and dependents. Even at night, privacy was scarce. Families often slept in heaps, and in noble households, servants were always on duty in the Lord's bedroom. My name is Brizatest. You're watching. Thanks for watching my content. I'd appreciate your subscription and like. Enjoy the video. In such a framework, there was simply no time or place for courtship as we know it. Nevertheless, men and women found ways to interact, albeit in ways that were vastly different from ours. Their communication was a language of glances, gestures, and complex rituals, which we now decipher through court records and ecclesiastical admonitions. It's crucial to understand the time we're discussing. Our focus is on the High and Late Middle Ages, from approximately the 10th to the 15th century. This was a period of transformation in Europe, marked by growing cities, the emergence of universities, and the Church's unprecedented assault on old tribal customs, seeking to gain full control over the institution of marriage. During this time, in the 10th century, lawyers and theologians articulated a revolutionary idea for the era. Marriage requires the consent of both parties, not just the fathers, but the bride and groom themselves. While this sounded like the dawn of freedom, in practice, it created a monstrous conflict between theory and reality. On one hand, the priest in the church would ask, "Do you agree?" On the other, at home, a father might threaten his daughter, "If you don't marry the miller next door, I'll break your ribs." And this was no mere figure of speech. Beating disobedient daughters and sons was a societal norm that went unchallenged. Chronicles are filled with stories of girls being dragged to the altar by force, and young men being wed to wealthy older women to settle family debts. However, it would be a mistake to view our ancestors solely as unfortunate victims of the system. Human psychology is adaptable. People of that time didn't expect from marriage what we do today. They weren't looking for a partner who would be a conversationalist, therapist, and best friend all in one. Their expectations were pragmatic. A husband should not squander the harvest and should protect the home, while a wife should manage the household and bear heirs. If affection or respect developed between them, it was seen as a great blessing, a pleasant bonus, but not a requirement. In the medieval mindset, love often resulted from marriage rather than the other way around. There was a saying, "Love, like boiling water, cools over time, while respect, like fine wine, only improves with age." Many couples, married off by their parents without their consent, lived long, harmonious lives because their union was bound by shared goals and mutual labour. Yet nature took its course. People fell in love, eloped, cheated, wrote passionate letters, and acted impulsively. church courts were inundated with cases of secret marriages, bigamy, and seduction. These dry records are our main source of truth. When we read a chivalric romance, we see a beautiful fairy tale. But when we open a court testimony, we hear real voices. The defense of a young man who promised to marry a girl to seduce her, and the tears of a girl who believed that exchanging rings at the altar constituted a real wedding. In our exploration, we will traverse all levels of the social ladder. We will discover that the poor, who had nothing to divide, paradoxically enjoyed more freedom in choosing a partner than dukes and kings. For aristocrats, their bodies were not their own, they were political instruments. A princess could be sent to another country at 5 to be raised at a foreign court, and married at 12 to a 40-year-old man she had only seen at her wedding. We will also dismantle a significant number of myths. We often hear that in the Middle Ages, everyone married at 12 and died at 30. This is untrue. The demographics were more complex, and the actual age of marriage in Europe varied greatly from region to region. We will see how money, dowries, and bride prices influence destinies more than beauty or virtue. We will peek into bedrooms and learn how the church attempted to regulate intimate lives by banning sex festivals, fasting, and even certain days of the week. But most importantly, we will strive to understand the logic of these people. They were neither foolish nor heartless. They lived under immense risks. Any decision could be fatal. An ill-fated marriage could ruin a family, lead to land loss, or even spark bloody feuds. Thus, the dating system, characterized by strict candidate selection by older relatives, served as a protective mechanism. This was a civilization where the collective was always more important than the individual. Yet, through the ages, amid harsh calculations and strict laws, a simple human need for warmth broke through. We will see this in found notes, in secret gifts, and in the songs of troubadours. The Middle Ages were not solely about filth and violence. They were also a time when people began to articulate their feelings in words, a time when, in a harsh world of contracts and deals, the timid flower of what we now call romance began to take root. But to witness this flower, we must first descend from the heavens to the earth, to an ordinary medieval village where 90% of Europe's population lived. The strange paradox of medieval society was that the lower you were on the social ladder, the more freedom you had in choosing a life partner. We tend to pity the medieval peasant. He was powerless, poor, crushed by taxes and hard labour. However, in matters of love, the son of a swineherd enjoyed a luxury denied to a prince. He could choose his wife himself. The reason for this freedom is cynical and simple. The poor had almost nothing to divide. They had no titles, no ancestral lands to unite with neighbouring estates, and no dynastic claims. Thus, parents and lords looked the other way at their marriage games, as long as it didn't interfere with work. 90% of Europe's population lived this way, in villages where everyone knew everything about each other from birth. So where did these people meet? There was no internet, no bars, but there was work. A peasant's life unfolded in the fields, and it was there, during haymaking or grape harvesting, that young men and women spent their days side by side. It was a unique environment, hard physical labour, summer heat, and minimal clothing. This environment created a unique tension. The church was aware of this risk and consistently insisted that men and women work separately. However, during the harvest season, when every hour counted, these restrictions were often overlooked. The fields became the first venue for flirting. Surprisingly, the churchyard emerged as a second focal point. On Sundays, it was the only place where the entire community could legally gather. Before and after the service, young people congregated at the entrance. It was a chance to exchange glances, share a few words, or show off a new dress or ribbon. In the Middle Ages, churchyards were bustling places. They were sites for trade, dancing, and even games, much to the dismay of the clergy. Yet the main catalysts for relationships were the festivals: May Day, Midsummer, and the Christmas season. The calendar provided legitimate excuses for revelry. The maypole, around which people danced, was not merely a decoration, but an ancient phallic symbol. For centuries, the church tried to ban these dances, labelling them as devilish. During these celebrations, special rules applied. Young people could venture into the woods to gather flowers or greet the dawn. Naturally, they returned dishevelled and happy. Did the infamous Cinova exist? Certainly, but it wasn't the chaotic debauchery often depicted in films. The village community kept a close watch on morality, though their standards differed from those of the church. The primary sin was not premarital intimacy, but the refusal to take responsibility. If a young man seduced a girl, the entire village expected him to marry her. In England and France, informal youth groups of unmarried men monitored the situation. If someone was courting a girl but delaying marriage, these men might stage a raucous nighttime serenade, banging pots and singing lewd songs until he announced his engagement. Attitudes towards premarital pregnancy were also pragmatic. The church condemned fornication, but peasants had a different perspective. For them, fertility was a vital asset. A woman who proved capable of conceiving elevated her status as a future mother. Court archives reveal numerous cases concerning paternity disputes. However, if a young man acknowledged the child and led the girl to the altar, the conflict was considered resolved. Often, weddings took place when the bride was already 5 or 6 months pregnant, and no one fainted from shame. Yet this peasant freedom had a strict limitation: the economy. You couldn't simply fall in love and get married. One needed a home and a piece of land to support a family, and land was scarce. Typically, a young man could marry only after his father died or retired, passing the farm on to him. This led many men to marry quite late, often around 25 or even 30 years old. Girls were usually younger, but not children. In peasant circles, brides were often around 20, as they needed to manage a demanding household, rather than just sit by the window sewing. If a young man lacked land, he remained a perpetual bachelor, with marriage prospects dwindling to zero. No land meant no wife. This unspoken rule shattered more lives than any parental prohibitions. Lovers could wait for years until a farm became available, or until they saved enough money to establish a household. Moreover, the shadow of the feudal lord loomed over the peasants. In most regions of Europe, serfs could not marry without the lord's permission. Obtaining this permission required paying a special tax, known in England as the quote one __. This was both humiliating and costly. Lords rarely outright forbade marriages. It was beneficial for them to have more workers born, but they viewed the weddings of their subjects as an opportunity to dip into their pockets. If a girl married a man from another village owned by a different lord, the tax could skyrocket, since the lord would lose a worker and her future children. Such cross-village marriages were complicated legal transactions. Even with taxes and poverty, peasant love was the most human experience of that era. Personal qualities were highly valued. Young men looked for hard-working girls with cheerful dispositions, while girls assessed the strength, earning potential, and character of the young men. They saw each other in action, in the dirt and in sweat, without pretense or masks. Their choices were deliberate. They had their own courtship rituals. A young man might carve a wooden spoon or spindle for a girl. If she accepted the gift and tucked it into her waistband, it signalled her consent, understood by the entire village. They might exchange halves of a coin. At fairs, they purchased ribbons and inexpensive trinkets. This was a simple, rough, yet sincere romance. In this world, there was no place for lofty troubadour ideals. Here, people didn't die from unrequited love. They perished from hunger or childbirth. Yet, it was often in peasant homes that one could find what we would today call a normal family. A couple that came together out of mutual affection, worked side by side, raised children, and aged together by the hearth. Their freedom was that of the impoverished, but it was freedom nonetheless. A very different picture emerges when we look up to those who lived in stone castles on the hills. For them, the word quote two meant nothing, while quote three dictated every breath. Welcome to the gilded cage of the aristocracy. If you think being a prince or princess in the Middle Ages meant living in a fairy tale, that tale was more aligned with horror. The peasant boy we left in the previous chapter enjoyed a luxury completely denied to kings. the right to a private life. The higher you climbed the social ladder, the less your body belonged to you. At the top of the pyramid, in royal and ducal families, the concept of personal choice vanished entirely. Here, marriage was not a union of two individuals, but a merger of two corporations, a military alliance or a peace treaty, secured not by a seal, but by living people. Imagine a child, a girl of 5 or 6, playing with dolls in the castle garden somewhere in Paris. At the same time, in a grim hall in London or Madrid, a group of stern men, lawyers, bishops and treasurers, discusses her fate. They argue not about the colour of her eyes or her character, but about how many cities she will bring along with her, how many knights her future husband will provide in case of war, and which fortresses will pass to the crown. The girl is an asset. She is referred to as a pledge of peace. Her task is to be born, survive, and be married off where it is politically advantageous. In this world, courtship did not exist. Instead, a complex machine of diplomacy and espionage operated. Since the bride and groom often lived thousands of kilometers apart, the first step in their acquaintance was sending an embassy. These were not romantic envoys with flowers, but pragmatic assessors. The ambassadors would personally inspect the candidate and send a report back to the sovereign. These reports have been preserved in archives, and reading them can be quite awkward. They resemble product inspection reports. The ambassadors described everything: the condition of teeth, freshness of breath, width of hips, ability to bear children, skin cleanliness, and any signs of hunchbacks or lameness. Special attention was given to whether there were any signs of syphilis or leprosy on the body. If it was a bride, the ambassadors might bribe maids to find out if she had regular menstrual cycles and whether she slept soundly. There was no romance, just pure physiology. The stability of the state depended on the health of these individuals. If a queen died in childbirth, or a king turned out to be infertile, civil war could ensue. The second tool of courtship was portraits. In the pre-photography era, this was the only way to see the face of a future spouse. An artist was sent to paint the bride, but here lay a significant catch. The artist understood who was paying his salary. If he portrayed the princess as she truly was, with pockmarks, a long nose or strabismus, the marriage could fall through, and the artist would be blamed for sabotaging a diplomatic mission. Thus, portraitists shamelessly flattered their subjects. For centuries, portrait artists have been known to enhance the appearance of their subjects, smoothing skin, altering hair colour, and even reshaping chins, long before the advent of digital editing. History is filled with tales of grooms who, upon meeting their brides in person after falling in love with their portraits, were filled with rage. Take King Henry VIII of England, for example. When he laid eyes on his bride, Anne of Cleves, he infamously called her a quote, _for__, and found himself unable to consummate the marriage, despite her looking charming in her painting. Yet for many, there was no escape. Contracts had been signed, armies disbanded, and there was no turning back. Often, the marriage ceremony would take place without one of the spouses present. This was known as a proxy marriage. If a groom was away fighting in a war or stationed far away, he would send a representative. This individual, usually a nobleman, would stand beside the bride at the altar and recite vows on behalf of his lord. There was a peculiar and symbolic ritual that legally solidified such a union. The bride would be placed in bed, while the groom's representative, still fully clothed, would lie beside her or simply touch her bare leg with his own. Sometimes, a naked sword would be placed between them as a symbol of separation. This was considered the official beginning of their married life, even though the husband and wife might not see each other for another year. The tragedy of aristocratic marriages lay in the profound loneliness they often entailed. Young girls, frequently mere children, were uprooted from their homes, separated from family and friends, and sent to foreign lands. They often spoke no language and were unfamiliar with the customs, while their husbands were sometimes not only strangers, but former enemies. Just a month prior, their fathers might have been killing each other's soldiers on the battlefield. Now, she was expected to share a bed with the son of her enemy to secure a fragile peace. Her court was filled with spies, and her letters home were opened and read. If she complained about her husband, she was told, Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most influential women of the 10th century, famously remarked that she married not a man, but a political idea. Even if her husband turned out to be cruel, drunken, or insane, divorce for a queen was nearly impossible. Of course, there were happy exceptions when political calculations aligned with personal affection. However, more often than not, it was a story of adaptation. Spouses learned to be partners in governance. A queen was a position. Her role was to ensure the continuity of power, temper the king's anger, engage in charity, and serve as a living symbol of the alliance between two realms. For men, the situation was only slightly better. Yes, a king wielded power, but he could not marry the woman he loved. A mismatched marriage was unacceptable. If a king fell for a countess or, heaven forbid, a commoner, he could take her as a mistress, but not as a wife. A queen had to be of equal rank. Thus, kings often found themselves trapped in close-knit familial unions. In Europe, all royal houses were interconnected by blood, making it a challenge for a young man to find a bride who wasn't a distant cousin or niece. This led to a kind of gilded cage. Outside there was glamour, feathers, and tournaments in honor of beautiful ladies. Inside, it was a cold calculation where people were mere pieces on a chessboard. Their feelings were irrelevant, and their tears went unseen. Yet there was another aspect that might shock us today, though it was considered normal back then: the age at which these individuals were placed on the board. We often hear that girls were married off almost as infants in the Middle Ages. Is this true, or just another myth? To understand when childhood truly ended and adulthood began, we must turn to dry statistics and debunk one of the most persistent misconceptions about the past. One of the most enduring myths about the Middle Ages, which travels from film to film and book to book, claims that life was short, and thus people matured quickly. Girls were supposedly married off at 12, and by 30, one was considered elderly, with few living to see 40. This worldview seems logical at first glance. We recall Juliet, who was not yet 14, and remember tales of child marriages among kings, nodding our heads in agreement. What a wild time! What wild customs! However, this portrayal is a grand optical illusion. It arose because history was long written from the perspective of chronicles that focused solely on the lives of the elite. Yes, if you were the daughter of the King of France or the Duke of Burgundy, you might indeed be married at 12, or even betrothed at 3. But the aristocracy made up a tiny fraction of the population, only 1 to 2%. To project their lifestyle onto everyone else is akin to judging modern society based on the scandals of Hollywood stars. The reality for the remaining 98% of the population was vastly different. Historical demography, a field that relies not on romantic legends but on cold figures from tax records and court documents, provides surprising insights. In northwestern Europe, specifically England, France, and the German territories, the average age for women to enter their first marriage ranged from 22 to 25 years. For men, it was even higher, between 25 and 28. This is remarkably close to 20th century figures. Why was this the case? The answer lies in the economy, which we've touched upon before. Without land, there could be no marriage. Unlike Eastern cultures or Southern Europe, where large clans lived under one roof, the Western model favoured the so-called nuclear family. A young couple needed to separate from their parents and establish their own household. To secure their own home, they either had to wait for an inheritance or earn money. Young people would move to cities, work as servants, or serve as apprentices, saving coins in their chests year after year. This was known as the service life cycle. Thus, a bride at 24 was the norm, a mature, independent woman who had worked, saved a dowry, and understood the value of money. Moreover, there was a purely biological factor often overlooked. We are accustomed to modern acceleration, where girls reach puberty around 11 or 12. However, in the Middle Ages, due to poor nutrition, lack of protein, and harsh living conditions, physiology operated differently. Menarche, or the onset of menstruation, typically occurred around 14 or 15 for medieval girls, sometimes even later. Therefore, a 12-year-old girl of that era was still very much a child, physically unprepared for married life or childbirth. Early marriages among the nobility at such a young age often remained formal. Couples were not placed in the same bed until the bride had fully matured. Ignoring this rule could lead to tragedy, and contemporaries understood this well. Chronicles condemned husbands who initiated intimate relations with their young wives too soon, believing it to be the cause of their illnesses or infertility. What about the myth that people were considered old by 30? This misconception stems from a misunderstanding of the term average life expectancy. Yes, statistics tell us that the average lifespan was about 30 to 35 years. However, this figure is skewed by the horrific rates of child mortality. If a family had 5 children, with 2 dying in infancy while 3 lived to 70, the average would still be around 30. In reality, if a person survived the dangerous early years, made it through adolescent epidemics, and did not perish in war, they had a good chance of living to 60 or even 70. Villages were filled with grandmothers and grandfathers. People were not rushing to marry at 15 out of fear of dying of old age the next day. They planned their lives a decade ahead. The church set the minimum marriage age at 12 for girls and 14 for boys, based on Roman law. However, it's crucial to understand that these were legal minimums, the lower limits of what was acceptable, not recommendations for action. Just as today, the law allows marriage at 18, it doesn't mean everyone rushes to the registry office on their birthday. Thus, a typical medieval wedding was a union between 2 adults. He is 27 and she is 23. They are not children, they know what they want. This maturity of the couple is what allowed the church to introduce a revolutionary idea into society. The idea that parental consent alone is not enough for marriage. The agreement of the individuals getting married is essential. If marriages were arranged for naive children, it would be foolish to expect them to make conscious decisions. However, since adults stood before the altar, the church began to insist that marriage is a sacred rite. It is not established at the moment parents sign a contract, but when a man and a woman voluntarily express their consent. This shift caused a tectonic change in European consciousness. The church, aiming to control society, unexpectedly became the foremost defender of individual rights regarding marriage. Priests started demanding that the word yes be spoken loudly and clearly, leading to numerous conflicts. Parents still wanted to dictate their children's futures, while the church proclaimed, quote 9. How did the church become the primary regulator of love and marriage? How did it combat incest, which was poorly understood? And why did priests despise secret weddings? We will explore these topics further, as the church's regulations established the framework for relationships within which Western civilization thrived for nearly 1,000 years. When we think of the medieval church, images of inquisitors, prohibitions, and pyres often come to mind. We tend to believe that religion only suppressed individuals, dictating how they should live and stripping them of freedom. Yet in the history of marriage, the Catholic Church of the 10th century took an unexpected turn. It became the first force to advocate for individual rights over family rights. It was the priests, these stern men in robes, who planted the seeds of change in the patriarchal system by declaring, marriage cannot exist without free consent. Before the 10th century, marriage was a private family affair. Fathers shook hands, transferred property, and that was that. The opinions of the bride and groom were of little concern. But then, Pope Alexander II issued decrees that changed everything. The Church articulated the principle that consent creates marriage. Not consummation, not money, not parental will, but words. This was a legal revolution. From that point on, if a girl was dragged to the altar against her will, and despite her father's threats, told the priest, quote, 11, or simply remained silent, the marriage was deemed invalid. Of course, reality was harsh. Fathers would beat their daughters into submission to extract a, quote, 12. But now, the victim had a powerful ally. In the church courts of that time, we find cases where women sought to have their marriages declared invalid because they were forced into them, and often, miraculously, the church sided with them, annulling advantageous alliances for feudal lords. Why did the church do this? Not out of pure humanitarianism, but as a struggle for power. By stripping secular lords of the right to decide who could marry whom, the the church was reclaiming control over society. Marriage became a sacrament, meaning only the church could determine its validity. However, this situation also had a darker side, turning people's lives into a nightmarish quest. The church was obsessed with the idea of incest. Today, we understand incest as relationships between close relatives, but medieval theologians took it much further. At one point, the prohibition extended to the seventh degree of kinship. Imagine a medieval village of 300 people, where everyone had intermarried over a century. Finding someone who wasn't your fourth or fifth cousin would have been mathematically impossible. According to church rules, nearly all marriages in Europe were illegal. This created a paradoxical situation. People lived in sin without realizing it. Moreover, the church invented the concept of spiritual kinship. Godparents became relatives not only to their godchild, but also to the biological parents. If you became the godfather of your beloved's daughter, congratulations, you could never marry her. This was considered spiritual incest. Even an intimate relationship outside of marriage created kinship. If a man slept with a woman, he could no longer marry any of her sisters or cousins. In the 10th century, the church realized it had gone too far and reduced the prohibition from the 7th to the 4th degree. But even this left a vast field for maneuvering. Ironically, these absurd prohibitions became loopholes for divorce. Since divorce was banned, aristocrats wishing to rid themselves of their wives suddenly recalled, often with the help of a bribe to a genealogist, that they shared a common great-grandfather with their spouse. The church would throw up its hands in horror. __quote _13__ and annulled the marriage. However, the biggest headache for the church was its own doctrine of consent. If consent creates marriage, what about secret marriages? Imagine two lovers meeting in the woods. The man says, quote 14. The woman replies, quote 15. There are no witnesses, no priest, but according to church law, they are now husband and wife. These were known as clandestine or secret marriages. They were a curse of the time. Young lovers, consumed by passion, exchanged vows and then faced problems. The man could change his mind and marry another wealthy bride. The abandoned girl would go to the church court and declare, quote 16. If she could find any evidence, or if the man admitted it under oath, the court would recognize their marriage as valid and annul his new official wedding. The church despised this situation. It demanded public declarations. The names of the bride and groom had to be called out in church for 3 consecutive Sundays, so that anyone aware of any impediments could speak up. Priests threatened excommunication for those who married secretly. Yet the church could not declare such marriages invalid without violating its own fundamental principle. Before God, words and intentions matter more than bureaucracy. Thus, the church created a unique system of checks and balances. It protected the freedom of choice, but surrounded it with countless conditions. It fought against immorality while establishing rules that allowed for manipulation of kinship. It sought to organize the chaos of human passions, channeling them into the framework of canon law. But human nature demanded its own. While lawyers debated degrees of kinship and parents calculated dowries, the soul yearned for something different. It felt constrained within the confines of marriage as a transaction and marriage as a sacrament. And so, medieval culture invented a third path, a parallel reality where the church's rules and the interests of families held no sway, a world ruled solely by passion. We call this courtly love. It was the most beautiful lie of the medieval era. If we open any modern fairy tale or watch a Hollywood film about knights, we see the same storyline. A noble knight performs heroic deeds for the sake of a beautiful lady, rescues her, and in the end, they have a grand wedding. They lived happily ever after. To a person from the medieval era, this plot would have seemed nonsensical. In their culture, the concepts of courtly love and lawful marriage not only did not align, they were enemies. In the 10th century, in southern France, in sunny Provence, a phenomenon emerged that would forever change European culture. This was courtly love, or as it was called then, fin amour, refined love. It was created by troubadours, poets, and aristocrats. The essence of this love lay in a paradox. It was only possible outside of marriage. Why was that? Recall the previous chapters. Marriage was a dull transaction, a contract for merging assets, where the husband was often much older than the wife and viewed her merely as a vessel for heirs. There was no mystery in marriage, no choice, and most importantly, no freedom. And love, as the poets claimed, is a gift that can only be given voluntarily. A wife is legally obligated to sleep with her husband. A mistress offers herself to her knight by the command of her heart. This led to a shocking conclusion. The ideal, beautiful lady was always someone else's wife. The knight who dedicates his victories in tournaments to his lady love is almost always courting his lord's wife. It was a dangerous game, elevated to the status of high art. The dynamics of this game mirrored a feudal hierarchy, but in reverse. In reality, men held authority over women. However, in the realm of courtly love, the woman became the lady, and the knight was her vassal. He pledged his loyalty to her, much like he would to a lord. He referred to her as Mins, a masculine term meaning my lord. His role was to serve, endure her whims, engage in acts of folly, and expect nothing in return. The most notable theorist of this system was André Capellanus, who authored a treatise on love. He boldly stated, "Love cannot exist between husband and wife. A husband and wife may respect each other, but passion, excitement, and the agonizing anticipation of a glance belong solely to lovers." But was this physical infidelity? Historians still debate this. Ideally, courtly love was meant to remain platonic, or teeter on the edge of it. It was an art form of distant affection. A knight could sigh for years, compose poetry, receive a ribbon or a glove from his lady, but he was not permitted to share her bed. The essence lay not in release, but in tension. It was an eternal courtship that never succumbed to the mundanity of daily life. If a knight succeeded in his pursuit and dragged the lady to his bed, the magic dissipated, and the prose of life began. Knights feared this prose more than dragons. Yet this game served a crucial social function. Castles were filled with young, aggressive men, younger sons, squires, and landless knights. They lacked wives, but had an abundance of testosterone and weaponry. This was a volatile mix. Courtly love acted as a kind of safety valve, channeling this energy into a harmless outlet. Instead of inciting rebellions or assaulting peasant women, these young wolves learned to play the lute, compose verses, and sublimated their desires into adoration for their lord's wife. This was advantageous for the lord as well. A knight infatuated with his wife served him loyally, hoping for a glimpse of his beloved during dinner. However, reality often shattered the rules of the game. Literature from that era, such as the famous tales of Tristan and Isolde or Lancelot and Guinevere, reveals that platonic feelings quickly morphed into physical desires. And then, the beautiful tale transformed into a crime story. Adultery in high society was perilous. If infidelity was uncovered, the consequences were dire. A wife could be confined to a convent or even executed, while the lover faced a torturous death. Thus, courtly love was steeped in adrenaline, filled with secret meetings, coded signals, and the fear of exposure. All of this only intensified the passion. It was during this era that the language of courtship we still use today began to take shape, often without our awareness. Giving flowers, holding doors open for women, standing when they enter a room, and carrying their photographs in wallets, all remnants of that chivalric service. We refer to it as romance, but for a medieval person, it was a code that distinguished the noble from the barbaric. Courtliness taught men to bathe, groom themselves, and engage in conversation. To win a lady's favour, it was no longer enough to be merely strong and wealthy. One had to be courteous, polite, and refined. The rough feudal lord, reeking of horse sweat and garlic, began to give way to the gentleman who appreciated music and fragrances. Now we arrive at a delicate topic. We have discussed feelings, duty, and poetry, but what about physiology? The Middle Ages are often depicted as an era of filth, rotten teeth, and unpleasant odours. How could physical attraction even arise in such conditions? Did knights and ladies truly love each other while pinching their noses? It's time to wash away the dirt of stereotypes surrounding this era and talk about the body, how they bathed, what cosmetics they used, what they found sexy, and how the beauty industry functioned 800 years ago. There's a popular stereotype that makes any professional medievalist cringe. It goes like this. In the Middle Ages, people went for years without bathing. The Queen of Spain boasted about having bathed only twice in her life, and the stench of unwashed bodies was masked by strong perfumes. This paints a grim picture. Dirty, smelly people in brocade and velvet trying to love one another. Let's separate fact from fiction right away. The myth of total uncleanliness pertains more to the later periods, the 15th and 16th centuries, when doctors genuinely began to believe that water opened pores to the plague, making bathing dangerous. However, during the High Middle Ages that we are discussing, a culture of bathing thrived. Cities in the 10th century, such as Paris, London or Bruges, were filled with public baths. A trip to the bath was not merely a hygienic procedure, it was the main social club of that time. People bathed, ate, drank wine, and, of course, observed one another. Baths were often mixed or had very loose divisions. The church regularly admonished them, labelling baths as hotbeds of vice, and they were not entirely wrong. The line between a public bath and a brothel often blurred, but the fact remains, people wanted to be clean. Peasants bathed in rivers and troughs, while aristocrats ordered wooden tubs filled with hot water right in their bedrooms, adding rosewater and medicinal herbs. If you had attended a medieval feast, you would have been struck not by the smell of sweat, but by the complexity of visual codes. People of that time were obsessed with appearance. This was their marketing. In a world without resumes or social media, your face and clothing conveyed everything about you, who you were, how much wealth you had, and whether you were open to relationships. Standards of female beauty were radically different from today's ideals. While modern trends favour a tan and athletic physique, the historical ideal was one of sickly pallor and fragility. A tan was seen as a mark of a peasant, toiling under the sun in the fields. A noble lady was expected to be as white as a lily. To achieve this, women resorted to tricks that seem outrageous today. They used lead-based white paint, which provided an instant porcelain effect, but slowly poisoned them with heavy metals. Beauty indeed demanded sacrifices. Another obsession was the high forehead. It was believed to signify intelligence and piety. To conform to this trend, fashionable women of the 15th century plucked their hairlines, pushing their hair back several centimetres. They also completely removed their eyebrows and eyelashes, leaving their faces as smooth, clean ovals resembling eggs. To modernise, such portraits may seem alien, but knights lost their minds over these browless beauties. What about men? Male fashion was aggressively sexual. While women's bodies were concealed under layers of fabric, with emphasis on the décolletage or a slim waist, men displayed their legs. From the 15th century onward, men's tunics became progressively shorter, eventually transforming into short jackets that barely covered the waist. Their legs were clad in hose, the ancestors of modern stockings or tights. This caused scandals, with priests decrying that young men shamelessly showcased their buttocks and the outlines of their genitals. But fashion was relentless. To accentuate masculinity, the codpiece was invented, a special pouch for the genitals that attached to trousers. Soon, it was padded with sawdust or fabric to visually enhance size. This was the medieval equivalent of a push-up for men. A gentleman entering a hall proclaimed with his very presence, "I am a male, I am strong, I am virile." Seduction in public became an art of micro-gestures. Since finding privacy was difficult, flirting occurred openly at the dining table. Medieval dining etiquette was quite intimate. Often, a knight and a lady would eat from the same plate and drink from the same cup, creating an incredible closeness. Imagine breaking off a piece of meat, dipping it in sauce, and offering it to the lady with your fingers. Forks had not yet been invented. She sips wine and hands the cup back to you, and your lips touch the same spot hers did. Under the table, another life unfolded. Touching a partner's feet was a common sign of interest. As she sips her wine and hands you the cup, you touch the same spot where her lips lingered. Beneath the table, another world thrived. The gentle brush of a partner's foot was a common sign of interest. If a lady didn't retract her foot, it was akin to a modern-day right swipe. the exchange of glances was governed by detailed treaties. There existed an entire science dedicated to the art of looking. A direct gaze was deemed bold, a sidelong glance was considered sly, while lowered eyes indicated submission, which men found appealing. Scents played an enormous role in social interactions. People were terrified of bad breath. Medical texts offered numerous recipes for mouth rinses made with mint, anise, and wine. Decayed teeth were indeed a concern, but they were often cleaned with cloth or charcoal. Bad breath could officially be a reason to decline a kiss during Mass, and a significant barrier to marriage. Aristocrats carried pomanders, intricately carved balls made of gold or silver, filled with sponges soaked in musk, amber, and rose oil. They were walking aromatherapy. Women used cosmetics despite the church's prohibitions. Theologians argued, to wear makeup is to correct God's work, and that is pride. Yet women still painted their lips, blushed their cheeks, and even dyed their hair. Blondes were more highly valued than brunettes, so they washed their hair with mixtures of ash, lemon, and chamomile, then spent hours in the sun to achieve the desired shade. Wide-brimmed hats without crowns allowed them to lay their hair out for bleaching, while protecting their faces from sunburn. Thus, when we observe a medieval couple, we see individuals striving to impress one another. He wears tight trousers that showcase his calves, paired with a short jacket featuring padded shoulders for added stature. She boasts an unnaturally high hairstyle, pale skin, and a tightly laced corset that lifts her bosom. They smell of cloves and musk, share a plate, and exchange meaningful glances. However, this display of vanity, all these tricks, powders, and enhancements, only held significance up to a point. Beauty could ignite passion, spark an affair, or inspire a poet. Yet when it came to serious discussions about marriage, the enchantment faded. Stern accountants took the stage, for beauty fades, but land and gold endure. Before leading the beauty to the altar, the groom and his father posed the crucial question: how much is she worth? When we witness a medieval wedding, we see a feast, lavish outfits, and faces that range from joyful to somber. However, for people of that time, a wedding was primarily the largest financial transaction of their lives. Stripping away the romantic veneer, marriage was a merger of assets, akin to forming a modern joint venture. As in any business, meticulous calculations ruled, where a misstep could lead to financial ruin. The prime fuel of the marriage market was the dowry. This term has echoed through countless fairy tales, yet we rarely contemplate its harsh reality. A dowry was the woman's entry fee into a new family. It represented a share of the inheritance that a father provided to his daughter during his lifetime, enabling her to leave for another household without claiming a portion of his estate after his death. The size of the dowry dictated everything. It acted as a filter determining the social standing the girl would attain. For a peasant girl, a dowry might consist of a trunk of linens, a cow, a few sheep, a copper cauldron, or a set of tools. In the village, everyone knew the value of each item. A girl with 2 cows was twice as appealing as one with just 1. This may sound cynical, but in a world where hunger was a constant threat, an extra cow meant a better chance of survival for future children. Among the aristocracy, the stakes soared. Here, the currency consisted of lands, castles, income-generating properties, and shiny coins. Often the question of dowry sparked wars. When Eleanor of Aquitaine married, she brought with her nearly half of France, and when she changed husbands, those lands followed her, reshaping the map of Europe. However, it would be a mistake to think that money flowed in only one direction. Medieval law was remarkably balanced. The groom also had to pay. There existed the concept of widow's share, or compensation. This served as a guarantee of safety for the woman. Before the wedding, the groom or his father was required to allocate part of his property, usually 1/3 or half, which would be the wife's for life if her husband died before her. This was the medieval equivalent of life insurance. Society recognized that women were vulnerable and often unable to earn a living on their own. If a husband died in battle or from illness, she should not be left destitute. The widow's share provided economic security for women. Often these terms were publicly recorded at the church door before the community, ensuring that no one could later claim, quote, _23 quote. The negotiation process for marriage resembled trading at an Eastern bazaar. Heads of families, uncles, notaries and brokers gathered in taverns or castle halls, debating for hours. They discussed every detail: how many sheets would be in the trunk, who would pay for the wedding feast, and when the payments would be made. Frequently, the dowry was not paid in full at once, but in installments over several years. And woe to the husband whose father-in-law delayed payments. Courts were inundated with lawsuits from sons-in-law demanding the promised funds. Sometimes, humorous situations arose. When cash was lacking, barter schemes came into play. There are known instances where knights accepted wine, fabric, grain, or even the right to collect taxes from a specific bridge for 5 years as dowries. But what happened to this money within the marriage? Here, a principle emerged that feminists might deem a nightmare, while lawyers would see it as a necessity. Once a woman said, quote, _24, she lost the right to manage her own property. The husband became the sole administrator of her dowry. He could spend the income from her lands, sell the harvest, or gamble away the money. Legally, she dissolved into her husband. However, he could not sell her land without her consent. This was a firm rule. If a husband secretly sold his wife's land to settle debts, after his death, the widow could go to court and reclaim the land, proving that the transaction was made against her will. Thus, savvy buyers always insisted that the wife be present at the transaction, confirming her consent separately, sometimes even requiring an oath that her husband had not beaten or intimidated her beforehand. The dowry served another, less obvious purpose. It acted as insurance against divorce. Yes, divorces did not exist, but annulments or separations did. If a marriage fell apart due to the husband's fault, or if the church deemed the union invalid, the husband was obligated to return the dowry in full. This was a tremendous deterrent. Imagine a feudal lord who grew weary of his wife and wished to send her to a convent. If he did so, he would have to relinquish a substantial portion of land and a mountain of gold that he had long considered his own. Often, the fear of financial ruin compelled spouses to tolerate each other and maintain the facade of family. Greed proved to be more reliable than morality. By the end of the medieval period, the system began to falter. Dowry inflation set in. In Italy and southern France, the prices for grooms skyrocketed to the point that many fathers could not afford to marry off their daughters. A family with 3 daughters faced inevitable financial ruin. This led to the tragedy of surplus women. Girls who lacked sufficient dowries were often sent en masse to convents. It was cheaper than assembling an adequate dowry. Convents became repositories for unwanted brides who had no calling to serve God, but became victims of market conditions. There was also a beautiful yet financially significant custom known as the morning gift. The morning after the wedding night, if all went well, the husband would present his wife with a gift. This could be jewellery, a purse filled with gold, or even a small castle. This gift became the woman's personal property, over which her husband had no claim. It was her pocket money, her personal reserve fund. The size of the morning gift was often pre-negotiated, killing any spontaneity. Marriage was built on 3 pillars: devoted brides, the widow's share from the groom, and the morning gift as a reward for virginity and consummation. In this equation, love was a variable, while money remained constant. Once financial matters were settled, lawyers rolled up their scrolls, fathers shook hands, and wine was poured. The hardest part was over. What remained was to make the union public. It was time to announce to the world that the deal was done and to cut off any escape routes. This stage was legally even more significant than the wedding ceremony itself. It was the time of engagement. In today's world, an engagement is a romantic gesture. The man kneels, presents a ring, the woman tears up with joy, and they take beautiful photos for their friends. If they argue a month later and decide to part ways, it's sad but not fatal. The ring is returned, the restaurant is cancelled, and they are free. However, in the medieval era, things were quite different. Engagement was a legal trap, far harder to escape than a modern divorce. Known as spansalia in that time, engagement was more than just a promise. It was a preliminary contract with legal weight. There were two distinct stages. The first was a promise for the future. The groom would say, "I will take you as my wife," and the bride would respond, "I will take you as my husband." Notice that both verbs were in the future tense. This indicated a firm intention, a deal made, but the sacred union had yet to occur. However, there was one detail that turned this promise into ironclad shackles. If physical intimacy occurred between the groom and bride after these words, the engagement automatically transformed into a legal marriage under church law. The logic was straightforward. You promised to marry and began acting like spouses, therefore you are spouses. No additional ceremonies were necessary. Many couples took advantage of this rule to hasten events and avoid paying a priest for the wedding. But for many, it became a trap. One passionate evening following the official engagement severed all avenues for retreat. The central ritual of the engagement involved not just the ring, but also a handshake. The heads of the families or the young couple themselves would join their right hands in front of witnesses. This was an ancient, pre-Christian gesture of sealing a deal, still used today when we shake hands or argue. The handshake solidified the agreement, more binding than any seal. Breaking a handshake was considered disgraceful. A person who broke such an oath was branded a perjurer, and society would shun them. It was often during the engagement, rather than the wedding, that rings were exchanged. The ring symbolized eternity and fidelity. But why do we wear it on the fourth finger? Medieval doctors and theologians had two theories on this. The first was anatomical and quite romantic. It was believed that a special vein, the vena amoris, or vein of love, ran from the fourth finger of the left hand directly to the heart. By placing the ring on this finger, a man symbolically closed off this vein, claiming the woman's heart for himself. The second theory was strictly religious. During the ceremony, the priest or groom would touch the bride's fingers with the ring, saying, "In the name of the Father, I touch the thumb. In the name of the Son, I touch the index finger. And in the name of the Holy Spirit, I touch the middle finger." At the word Amen, the ring was placed on the fourth finger. Thus, the fourth finger became the guardian of the marriage vow. The rings themselves varied. Poor couples used iron or bronze, while the wealthy opted for gold adorned with gems. Each stone held its own significance. A sapphire was believed to change colour if the wife was unfaithful. A diamond symbolised unbreakable feelings. Often rings featured engravings inside with secret messages known only to the owner. But the most daunting and public stage was the announcement. The church, in its battle against clandestine marriages and incest, enforced a strict rule. Everyone must be informed of the upcoming wedding. For 3 consecutive Sundays, during the main mass when the entire village or city block gathered, the priest would loudly announce the names of the groom and bride. He would ask the congregation if anyone knew of any reason these two should not marry. Did the groom have another wife in a neighbouring town? Were they secret relatives? Had either of them taken a vow of celibacy? This was a medieval reputation audit. For the bride and groom, these 3 weeks were filled with immense stress. Any envious person, rejected lover, or old family enemy could stand up and shout, "I protest!" Just one rumour was enough for the priest to halt the wedding preparations and launch an investigation. While this was ongoing, the girl's reputation could be irreparably damaged. If it turned out that the groom had promised to marry someone else 5 years prior, the engagement would be annulled. If someone knew of an obstacle but remained silent, and the truth came to light after the wedding, that person committed a grave sin and faced excommunication from the church. The system of denunciation worked flawlessly. Society regulated its own purity. Breaking off an engagement was a legal disaster. Church court archives are filled with cases of broken marriage promises. Jilted brides and grooms didn't sue for a broken heart. They sought compensation for damages. They demanded money for wasted time, purchased outfits, and loss of market value. A girl left after an engagement was considered damaged goods, even if she remained a virgin. Suspicion fell upon her. Why was she abandoned? Perhaps she had a bad temper or a hidden illness. finding a new husband became exponentially more difficult. Thus, on the wedding day, the couple approached not in a state of euphoria, but as survivors of a marathon. They had navigated negotiations over money, health checks, public name announcements, and the risk of scandal. All legal formalities were settled. Society had given its approval, and relatives had shaken hands. What remained was the most crucial and boisterous part: the day the contract came into effect. This day was nothing like the solemn ceremonies we see in films. A medieval wedding was a carnival, a mix of piety and wild revelry, where the bride's dress could be any colour but white. Often the ceremony took place not even inside a church, but outside, in the rain and wind. If a time machine had transported you to a typical medieval wedding, the first feeling would be deep confusion. You wouldn't see the bride in a pristine white dress. There would be no solemn organ music as the father led his daughter to the altar. Most importantly, you would find that the key part of the ceremony occurred not inside the church, in silence and dimness, but outside, on the church steps, amidst noise, wind, city dust, and the cries of the crowd. Let's debunk the main visual myth. The white dress is a 19th century invention that gained popularity thanks to Queen Victoria of England. For a medieval person, the colour white was associated either with mourning — French queens wore white for that reason — or with poverty, as uncoloured fabric was the cheapest. A wealthy bride needed to showcase her family's affluence, so she donned the brightest and most extravagant attire. The most popular colour was blue, symbolising the Virgin Mary and representing purity and fidelity. This is where the English tradition of the bride wearing something blue originated. However, if the father had money, the bride could wear red, gold, purple, or emerald green. Dresses were made from damask, velvet, and silk, adorned with fur and precious stones. This dress was not a one-time wear, as today. It became the woman's best outfit for life. She would wear it for all significant celebrations, and even pass it down through generations. Peasant brides also wore their best dresses, typically woolen but decorated with fresh ribbons and embroidery. The ceremony itself began with a procession. The bride and groom walked to the church from their homes, accompanied by musicians. There was no quiet reverence. Violins, bagpipes, drums, and flutes blared throughout the street. The noise held sacred significance. It was believed that loud sounds warded off demons eager to cast a spell on the newlyweds on their day of happiness. As they approached the church, the couple did not enter. According to medieval customs, marriage was primarily a worldly contract, meant to be established in the presence of the church, literally at its doorstep. The priest would step out onto the porch to perform the ceremony. Here, on the threshold, the legal magic happened. The priest inquired about any impediments, and then the bride and groom exchanged vows. These vows were spoken in the vernacular, not in Latin, ensuring that everyone present could understand every word. In England, for instance, the wording of these vows has remained nearly unchanged for 7 centuries. To love in sickness and in health, in wealth and in poverty, until death do us part. After the vows, the groom presented the bride with a ring and a pouch filled with coins or money. This act symbolised the transfer of the widow's provision we discussed earlier. The groom would proclaim, "With this gold and silver I bestow upon you." The crowd of onlookers witnessed the acceptance of these financial obligations. Only after the ring was on the bride's finger and the money in her hands would the church doors swing open, allowing them to enter for the wedding mass. Inside, a beautiful yet somewhat forgotten ritual took place. As the newlyweds knelt at the altar, a special cloth or cloak was draped over them, symbolising that they were now one flesh, sheltered under one roof. An interesting legal aspect of this ritual was that if the couple had any illegitimate children by the time of the wedding, a common occurrence, those children would be brought into the church and placed under the same cloak with their parents. From that moment on, they were considered fully legitimate and entitled to inheritance. The community referred to such children as, quote, 9. After the Mass came the moment known as the Kiss of Peace. The priest would kiss a special plaque depicting the crucifix, then kiss the groom, who in turn kissed the bride. This marked the first public kiss, officially sanctioned by the church, formal, dignified, and devoid of passion. But then the real celebration began. Medieval wedding feasts were a test of both stomachs and wallets. For the aristocrats, tables overflowed with game, featuring roasted swans and peacocks, which were dressed in their own feathers and gilded beaks after cooking. It was a feast for the eyes. Guests were often served a dish with a surprise, where live birds could burst forth from a massive pie, or a jester might leap out. Wine flowed freely, often young, strong, and poorly filtered, spiced for flavour. Given the dangers of drinking water, guests would reach a critical level of inebriation by mid-evening. Medieval banquets were loud, filled with coarse jokes that would make us blush today. Minstrels and jugglers entertained the crowd, frequently performing songs with rather risque lyrics. Weddings celebrated fertility, so hints about the upcoming wedding night echoed in every toast. For the common folk, the menu was simpler: roasted pork, porridge, cheese, and plenty of ale. Yet the revelry was just as lively. There was a tradition of showering the newlyweds with grains, such as wheat or barley, symbols of fertility. Guests would toss grains at the couple's faces and clothes, wishing them many children. Later, during lean years, grains were replaced with small paper confetti, but the essence remained the same: a wish for seeds and harvest. Gifts were an essential part of the celebration. Guests would present useful items, dishes, fabrics, and furniture, rather than envelopes of cash. All of this was meticulously recorded, as weddings served as a means for the young couple to gather a starting capital for their household. However, beneath the festivities lay danger. Medieval people were quick to anger, often carrying knives, which they used for eating due to a lack of proper utensils. A drunken quarrel could easily escalate into a knife fight. Chronicles are filled with accounts of how the groom's uncle struck the bride's brother with a pitcher over a dispute regarding the dowry, ending the celebration in bloodshed. To prevent such incidents, special marshals were appointed from among sober and sturdy relatives to maintain order and break up fights. As the sun began to set, the atmosphere shifted. The older generation exchanged knowing glances, while the younger ones giggled. The public, legal, and culinary aspects of the celebration were coming to an end. The climax, for which everyone had gathered, was approaching. The church had blessed their souls, but now society needed to ensure that their bodies would unite as well. Preparations began for the couple's bedding. If you think they could quietly slip away to their room and lock the door, you're mistaken. In medieval times, the concept of privacy was virtually non-existent, even on the wedding night. Instead, what occurred in the bedroom was a matter of public interest and neighbourly curiosity. As the wedding feast reached its peak, with guests barely able to stand from drink and dancing, the most peculiar and awkward part of the medieval wedding ritual began. While today's newlyweds may dream of escaping to their hotel room for some privacy, in the Middle Ages that was impossible. Guests followed them. This ritual was called the bedding ceremony, widespread across Europe, from peasant huts to royal palaces. Its significance was twofold, both magical and legal. Society needed to witness the physical consummation of the marriage, while the church aimed to cleanse the marital bed of demons. The ceremony commenced with a boisterous procession. To the sounds of trumpets, drums, and the drunken laughter of friends, the couple was led to the bedroom. This was no intimate march, it resembled a convoy. The room would be filled to capacity with relatives, friends, and servants, all eager to witness the conclusion of the event. The priest would first step in. In medieval times, the bed was considered a dangerous place. It was where life began and ended, and where a person was most vulnerable in sleep. It was also where conception took place, which, while permitted in marriage, was still viewed by the church as somewhat unclean and inviting of unholy forces. Special prayers were recited to bless the marriage bed. The priest would sprinkle the mattress, pillows, and blankets with holy water and incense them, driving away succubi and incubi, the demons of lust who might impersonate the spouses or corrupt the seed. Next came the unveiling. Literally, the bridesmaids would remove the bride's wedding attire, undo her braids, and take off her jewellery. The groom's friends would undress him, sharing crude jokes and offering advice on how to maintain dignity. It's important to remember that in medieval times, people typically slept completely naked. Nightshirts and caps became common only later. Thus, the moment when the bride and groom stood before each other and the crowd of guests was one of complete nudity. Were they embarrassed? Certainly, but the concept of shame was different. This was a public procedure. The couple would be laid in bed, covered with a blanket, and then the priest would bless them once more, now lying together. After this, guests were expected to present the couple with a special drink. In England, it was called posset, a hot milk drink curdled with wine or ale, sweetened and spiced. In France and Italy, it was wine infused with cinnamon and ginger. This energizing drink was believed to give the groom strength and vigor for the task ahead. Guests would pass the cup around, drinking to the health of the newlyweds while sitting right at the edge of the bed. For royalty, this procedure was a matter of state importance. When a king married, the highest officials of the realm could remain in the bedroom to officially witness that the king and queen shared the same bed. Sometimes, as in the case of English King Henry VI's marriage, witnesses would stay in the room until the couple was under the covers, only then drawing the heavy curtains of the bed, leaving the spouses in relative privacy. Yet even then, guards would often be stationed outside, listening for sounds from the bedroom throughout the night, ready to report by morning whether the consummation had taken place. Why such insistence? In canon law, marriage was deemed incomplete until the consummation of the sexual act. If a priest officiated a wedding, but the couple did not engage in intimacy, the marriage could be easily annulled. This created a legal loophole that made relatives, especially those of the bride, deeply invested in ensuring the union was solidified. Only after consummation did a woman gain the right to her widow's share and property protection. Without this act, she held no status. The following morning often brought a verification process. In certain regions, particularly in Italy and Spain, there was a custom of displaying a blood-stained sheet as proof of the bride's virginity. If there was no blood, it could lead to a scandal, a breakdown of relationships, and demands for the dowry to be returned. The bride's family would face disgrace. Consequently, if a woman was not a virgin, or if the consummation did not occur, some resorted to trickery, using chicken blood or hidden vials. It was a performance where everyone played their part to preserve honor. But what transpired behind closed curtains? The church even sought to regulate positions during intercourse. The only acceptable position was for the man to be on top. Any deviations were considered sinful. Oral and anal stimulation were punished more severely than adultery. Theologians wrote extensive treatises arguing that the sole purpose of sex was procreation, and seeking pleasure for its own sake was considered indulgence in lust. Engaging in sexual relations during Lent, on Sundays, Wednesdays and Fridays, as well as during church holidays, was viewed as sinful. When tallying all the forbidden days, medieval couples had limited opportunities for intimacy. Additionally, there was a belief that conceiving a child during menstruation would result in a red-haired, ugly offspring, or worse, a vampire or leper. This fear of impure blood was deeply ingrained in men's minds. However, the greatest nightmare of the wedding night was not the public scrutiny or church prohibitions, but the fear of failure. If the groom, due to nerves, intoxication, or exhaustion, was unable to fulfill his marital duty, it was a disaster. This was not merely a personal failure, but a legal issue. If impotence was proven to be permanent, the wife had the right to demand a divorce. This leads us to one of the most humiliating chapters in medieval history: impotence trials. When love faded or never began, and living together became unbearable, people sought a way out. Divorce was forbidden by God, but lawyers, being resourceful, devised methods to prove that the marriage never truly existed. Sometimes, this required examinations that would leave modern individuals aghast. In today's world, when a marriage faces difficulties, spouses go to court, divide assets, establish child visitation schedules, and within months, they are free individuals. In the Middle Ages, such options did not exist. The Catholic Church maintained a strict stance. What God has joined, let no man separate. Marriage was indissoluble until death. If you made a poor choice, if your husband turned out to be a sadist and your wife a nagging shrew, that was your cross to bear until the grave. Yet, human nature always seeks a way out of a deadlock, and lawyers always look for ways to profit. Since divorce was not an option, a brilliant legal workaround was devised: annulment. This was not a divorce. It was an official acknowledgement that the marriage never existed, that the sacrament did not occur due to some breach of conditions. The spouses did not separate. They simply returned to their original state, as if they had never met. The most common reason for such annulments was the very kinship we mentioned earlier. Since all the aristocrats of Europe were related, finding a common ancestor was a technicality. If a feudal lord wanted to rid himself of an old or barren wife, he would hire genealogy experts. They would sift through archives and suddenly discover that the couple shared a great-grandfather. The count would feign shock. __quote _10 ___, and the church would oblige. The marriage would be declared invalid. The count could then marry a young woman without guilt, while the former wife was sent to a convent to live out her days in penance. This is precisely what happened with French King Louis VI and Eleanor of Aquitaine. When she no longer pleased him and primarily bore daughters, he suddenly remembered their kinship. Ironically, his next wife was an even closer relative. Yet the Pope turned a blind eye to this. If no kinship could be found, heavier artillery was employed: accusations of male impotence. In canon law, a marriage without sex was not considered a marriage. If the husband could not fulfill his marital duties, the wife had every right to demand annulment. This led to some of the most humiliating trials in human history. The ecclesiastical court had to establish the truth. Initially, they relied on oaths. The husband would swear he was healthy, while the wife would swear he was impotent. 7 hands, 7 relatives or neighbours were summoned to swear they believed one side's testimony. If the oaths proved insufficient, an examination was ordered. A group of honest women, typically midwives or respected matrons, would take the man into a separate room. Their task was to inspect his genitals, touch them, and provide a report on whether they appeared capable of functioning. Imagine the state of a man being examined by 5 elderly women, discussing the size and shape of his member, only to report back to the bishop. But that was not the end of it. In late medieval times, particularly in France, if the matrons had doubts, the court could mandate a congress trial. This was essentially a forced sexual act in the presence of witnesses. Neutral territory was designated for the couple, where judges, doctors, and midwives would gather. Witnesses could either remain behind a screen or be present in the room. The man had to prove his capability on the spot, under pressure, knowing that his honour and the fate of his lands depended on it. Naturally, in such circumstances, many men suffered failures due to overwhelming stress. The woman would emerge victorious, and the marriage would be annulled. The man would be officially barred from entering a new marriage, as he was deemed incapable of family life. His only chance for rehabilitation was to find a new woman, conceive a child out of wedlock, and present that child to the court as proof. "Look, I can." Then the ban would be lifted. Other grounds for annulment included coercion and fear. If it could be proven that the bride was dragged to the altar under threat of death, the marriage would be annulled. However, proving this was incredibly difficult. Bruises would heal, and witnesses, fearing the wrath of the bride's father, typically remained silent. Another reason was prior engagement. If it was discovered that the man was already betrothed to someone else and had been intimate with that woman before the current wedding, the current marriage would be deemed invalid, and the man would be forcibly returned to his first fiancée. This opened the door for significant blackmail opportunities. A forgotten mistress could reappear with a child in her arms and a couple of false witnesses. In an instant, the Duke's legitimate marriage could collapse. But what if annulment was not possible? If the husband was healthy, there was no kinship, and living together was unbearable due to the husband's violent behaviour or open infidelity. The church allowed for separation from bed and board. This was the saddest outcome. The couple could live in different homes. The wife might go to her parents or a convent, while the husband remained in the castle. Yet legally, they remained husband and wife. Neither could enter a new marriage while the other was alive. They were condemned to loneliness. The man could, of course, take a mistress, but any children from that relationship would be bastards with no inheritance rights. For a woman, such a status was social death. She was neither a widow, nor a wife, nor a maiden. She existed in a state of limbo. The strictness of these societal rules gave rise to a vast underground world, a realm where individuals led double lives, where kings had official mistresses wielding more political influence than queens, and where priests, forbidden to marry, kept housekeepers who bore them children. Medieval society, cornered by unattainable moral standards, became adept at hypocrisy. If divorce was not an option, it was termed annulment. If marriage was off the table, they lived in sin but called it concubinage. This secret world, filled with women who loved without a marriage certificate and children born outside the law, is what we will explore in the next chapter. Because in the Middle Ages, bastards were not outcasts. They formed a distinct and powerful caste. While the grand entrance to family life was boarded up by harsh laws and ecclesiastical prohibitions, the back door remained wide open, bustling with activity, far more vibrant than one might assume. A society that publicly proclaimed ideals of chastity and monogamy secretly constructed an intricate web of clandestine relationships. In this system, a mistress could hold a higher status than a legal wife, and an illegitimate son could ascend to the throne. Let's begin with those who loudly condemned sin, the clergy. Catholic priests were bound to celibacy and were forbidden from marrying, yet human nature prevailed, and living alone while managing a household proved challenging. Thus, the secret of each parish was well known. The priest often had what was known as a familiar, or a housekeeper. Formally, she was listed as a servant or a distant relative, but in reality, she was his common-law wife. Parishioners not only accepted this arrangement, but often approved of it. The logic among the peasants was pragmatic. If the priest had his own woman, he would not be tempted by our wives and daughters. Bishops turned a blind eye, transforming sin into a business. There existed a special tax called calagium. The priest paid an annual fee to the bishop for the right to live with a woman unofficially. This was a legalized bribe that filled the church's coffers. Children from these unions, though considered bastards, often followed in their father's footsteps, inheriting the parish from him, despite all canonical prohibitions. In the upper echelons of society, the situation was even more intriguing. We have already mentioned that an aristocrat's marriage was a political affair. A wife was essential for producing a legitimate heir and managing the estate. However, for companionship, intellectual discourse, and pleasure, there existed the institution of mistresses. In the 10th century, King Charles VI of France, the same monarch crowned by Joan of Arc, revolutionized social norms by officially introducing his mistress, Agnès Sorel, to the court. She was granted a title and a retinue, shocking everyone. Previously, kings hid their lovers away in distant chambers, but now, the mistress sat at the king's right hand, overshadowing the queen. Agnès Sorel became a style icon of her time, popularizing dresses with extremely low necklines that exposed one breast entirely. Clerics were furious, calling it the gateway to hell. Yet all the ladies at court immediately began to imitate this style to please the king. The status of the official mistress became prestigious. She was not merely a woman for the bed, it was a recognized position. Through her, appointments were made, and she received gifts from foreign powers. Often, the queen and the mistress struck an unspoken pact of non-aggression and even formed friendships, dividing their spheres of influence. The queen received honours and children, while the mistress enjoyed the king's favour and the latest fashions. But what about the children born out of wedlock? Today the term _14 carries a derogatory connotation. In the Middle Ages, it was merely a statement of fact that did not doom a person's fate. On the contrary, great bastards were part of the elite. A duke or king could not pass the throne or ancestral lands to a bastard, as that would undermine the law. However, he was obligated to care for his bloodline. Bastards were raised alongside legitimate children in the castle and were taught to wield swords and manage people. They became the reserve and the most loyal servants. A legitimate son could rebel against his father, demanding his inheritance, but a bastard owed everything to his father, knowing that his position relied solely on personal loyalty. History is replete with examples of illegitimate children rising to prominence. William the Conqueror, the man who changed the course of English history, was the illegitimate son of the Duke of Normandy and a tanner's daughter. In documents, he was referred to as William the Bastard, and took pride in that title until he earned a new one. The great commander of the 100 Years' War, Jean de Dunois, a companion of Joan of Arc, proudly bore the title of the Bastard of Orléans. In heraldry, there were even special insignia for bastards. A bastard's coat of arms featured a diagonal stripe crossing the shield from left to right. This was not a mark of shame, but a sign that noble blood flowed through this person, albeit from the quote, 15 side. Bastards became bishops, admirals, and marshals. For a nobleman, having many bastards was seen as a sign of virility. The situation was entirely different for the poor. Here, an illegitimate child was a tragedy. A peasant lacked the resources to feed an extra mouth. A single mother in a village became an outcast, and her child faced poverty. Thus, among commoners, it was not favoritism that thrived, but bigamy. The medieval world operated without passports or centralized databases. A person could leave their village, travel 50 kilometers to a neighboring town, adopt a new name, and start afresh. Many men, weary of a nagging wife and a horde of children, simply vanished. They would seek work and not return. A year later, in another county, they would remarry. The church attempted to combat this by requiring bans and certificates, but verifying the background of a travelling craftsman was nearly impossible. Court archives reveal astonishing stories. For instance, there is a case of a woman who arrived in a town and recognized her long-lost husband, a baker, who had been missing for a decade. The baker, now with a new family and 3 children, swore on all that was holy that he had never seen this woman before. The court summoned witnesses and arranged confrontations, but often the truth remained elusive. There were instances where bigamy was uncovered only after death, when 2 widows from different towns laid claim to the inheritance. This would spark a legal battle, primarily affecting the children of the second wife, who were deemed illegitimate and stripped of everything. However, there existed an illegal form of cohabitation that the church despised yet tolerated: concubinage. In Roman law, this was a union between a man and a woman without marriage, but with obligations of fidelity. In the Middle Ages, this was often practiced by widowers. If a man lost his wife but had adult children, remarrying was disadvantageous. A new wife and new legitimate children would begin to claim the property of the first children. Therefore, a widower would take in a woman, often from a lower class, and live with her openly. Society deemed this arrangement fair. She received support and protection, while he gained companionship and warmth, all while safeguarding the inheritance. It was a compromise between affection and capital. Thus, medieval morality was far more flexible than we might assume. It harshly punished rule breakers, but readily created exceptions for those with wealth or power. Bastards commanded armies, mistresses set fashion trends, and priests raised their children. Life forged its path through any dogma, yet there was one category of people for whom the death of a spouse marked not an end, but a paradoxical beginning of a new, freer life: the widows. Women who outlived their husbands suddenly gained what they had been denied since birth: the right to control their own lives and finances. It was these lively widows who became the true objects of pursuit. In a world where medicine was limited to conspiracies and bloodletting, death was a frequent visitor in every household. People died from childbirth, infections, wars, and accidents. The statistics were relentless. In the Middle Ages, marriages typically lasted around 10 to 15 years, after which one spouse would often find themselves at the graveyard. However, for the surviving partner, this was not merely an end, but also a new beginning. The market for second, third, and even fourth marriages was a bustling hub, filled with passions that often ran deeper than those of first weddings. The fate of women during this time is particularly intriguing. We often pity medieval women, viewing them as powerless shadows of men, and this holds true during 2 phases of their lives. As daughters, they were controlled by their fathers, and as wives, by their husbands. Yet upon the death of her spouse, a remarkable transformation occurred. The widow suddenly gained a legal status that no one else possessed. In English law, this was referred to as, quote, 16 a single woman. Widows became full legal entities, capable of entering contracts, conducting trade, initiating lawsuits, and owning property. No one, neither a father nor an adult son, could dictate how she spent her money. And she had money. She reclaimed her dowry and took possession of her widow's share, typically 1/3 or 1/2 of her husband's estate, which was guaranteed to her at marriage. This made wealthy widows the most sought-after prizes in the marriage market, leading to a genuine chase for their hand. Young, ambitious knights without land dreamed of marrying an older widow. It was a social ladder. Marry a woman 20 years your senior, endure her for a few years, and upon her passing, gain control over her assets. This was known as a marriage for wealth, and society viewed it with a cynical understanding. However, widows were not to be underestimated. Many, having suffered in their first marriage with a tyrannical husband, were in no rush to don the yoke of matrimony again. They had tasted freedom. City tax records reveal hundreds of entries listing women as heads of households. Widows of merchants and craftsmen often continued their late husbands' businesses. Remarkably, guild regulations that typically barred women from becoming masters made exceptions for widows. A woman could run a blacksmith shop, a weaving workshop, or a brewery, hire apprentices, and stamp her mark on goods. The title, Widow of So-and-so, became a respected brand. Yet this newfound freedom came with a price. If a widow was of noble birth and owned land tied to military service, the king could not allow her to remain single for long. A vassal was required to fight, and a woman could not do so. Thus, kings often forcibly married wealthy widows to their loyal subjects as a reward for distinguished knights. Here's a widow with a castle and 3 villages. Live well and serve. To avoid such a fate, women resorted to clever tactics. They took vows of chastity. A widow would visit a bishop, receive a special ring and a dark, closed mantle, and swear never to engage in carnal relations again. This did not make her a nun. She continued to live in her home and manage her finances, but legally she became the bride of Christ, and the king could no longer compel her to marry. It was a brilliant way to maintain independence under the guise of religion. However, there was a darker side to the hunt for widows: abductions. Legal records from England even contain the term raptus, meaning abduction. Armed riders would raid estates, seize a widow, and take her to a forest or another castle, where, under threat of violence or death, they would force a priest to marry them. Once the marriage was consummated, it was deemed legal, and the abductor became the owner of her lands. Courts attempted to combat this, but often the abductor would simply pay a fine to the king and remain her legal husband. For men, the situation was different. A widower with children needed not just money, but a manager for his household. He required a new mistress for his home. As a result, widowers remarried very quickly, often before even observing the minimal mourning period, typically choosing young women. Such unions, an old man with a young maiden or an elderly woman with a young man, provoked laughter and disapproval among the community. Villagers viewed this as a violation of the natural order. They believed the youthful partner's sexual energy would be wasted on the old. To express their disdain, they held a quote 20, a wild folk custom. At night, a crowd of youths would gather outside the newlyweds' home, banging pots, rattling noisemakers, singing lewd songs, and blowing horns. This raucous concert could last several nights, until the newlyweds bought their way out with a barrel of wine or money for a communal feast. It was society's way of saying, quote, 21. Sometimes, second marriages were attempts to rectify youthful mistakes. Those who had been forced into their first marriage by their parents often chose with their hearts the second time around. Widows, having financial independence, could marry for love, even if their partner was of lower status. An aristocrat could marry her steward, and a queen could wed a common nobleman. Such unions were termed, quote, 22, yet they often turned out to be the happiest. There was a touching custom related to memory. Widows were allowed to wear mourning attire, but many continued to wear their wedding rings from their first marriage, alongside those from their second. The church disapproved of bigamy, even in symbols, yet women stubbornly preserved the memory of those with whom they had shared their lives. In their wills, widows frequently requested to be buried not next to their second husbands, with whom they had spent the last 5 years, but beside their first husbands, with whom they had raised children and built a home. Widowhood was a time when masks were removed. The wicked became even more wicked, and the free became freer. One of the most renowned works of the Middle Ages, underscore, quote, quote, underscore, by Geoffrey Chaucer, presents us with the character of the wife of Bath. This woman, who buried 5 husbands, embarks on a pilgrimage not to atone for her sins, but to seek a 6th. She is lively, wealthy, dressed in red stockings, and has a gap between her teeth, a sign of lustfulness. She openly declares, underscore, quote, 24, underscore. This character embodies the essence of medieval zest for life. Death was ever present, yet people did not fall into despair. They mourned, buried their loved ones, and immediately plunged back into the depths of life, love, and commerce. They rushed to live. We have journeyed a long way from peasant fields to royal chambers. We have witnessed calculation, violence, money, laws, and ecclesiastical prohibitions. It seems that in this harsh structure, there was simply no room for the feeling we call love. Were they all just cold cynics? Did hearts function differently 800 years ago? In our final chapter, we will attempt to answer this question by delving into personal letters and diaries that have miraculously survived to this day, and the answer may surprise you. We have traversed through 15 chapters, peering into peasant huts and royal bedrooms, dissecting legal claims and marriage contracts. We have seen a world ruled by money, where a father could beat his daughter for refusing to marry, where the church intruded into the bedroom with a calendar of permissible days, and where lawyers sought loopholes to declare families non-existent. Looking at this grim construct of duty, profit, and coercion, it is easy to draw a cynical conclusion. There was no love in the Middle Ages. Was it a cold world of calculating individuals, where feelings were seen as weakness or illness? Was all the romance we see in films a lie concocted in the 19th century? But such a conclusion would be the greatest error of our investigation, for laws and contracts are the skeleton of society, but not its soul. The skeleton always appears daunting and rigid, yet it supports the warm, living flesh. If we set aside the legal codes and take into our hands the personal letters that have miraculously survived in damp chests, we will hear entirely different voices. One of the most remarkable archives from that era is the correspondence of the Paston family, English nobles from the 15th century. Marjorie Paston writes to her husband John, who has gone to London on business. In her letters, war and tenderness intertwine in a remarkable way. In one moment, she asks him to send crossbows and ammunition, as their estate is under siege by enemies. In the next, she pleads for almonds and sugar, confessing her longing for something sweet. She affectionately refers to him as, quote, 25, long before this holiday became a commercial phenomenon. She writes to him, quote, 26. For a woman of her time, who valued status, this admission held more weight than 100 modern, quote, 27. We witness how feelings have transformed. They didn't start with a spark. The medieval model of relationships operated differently. While we often fall in love first and then attempt to build a life together, sometimes our boat capsizes as passion fades and obligations remain. They laid the groundwork first. They established a household, shared goals, and built a reliable foundation before love took root in that secure home. This was a different kind of love, not the passionate eros celebrated by troubadours, but rather a deep, calm attachment rooted in respect and gratitude. Husbands and wives were partners in a survival team. In a world fraught with dangers, where a poor harvest could lead to famine and a simple cold could spell death, the support of a partner was the only wall to lean against. When that wall crumbled, the grief was profound. History gives us the example of King Edward I. A fierce politician and warrior, his marriage to Eleanor of Castile was purely political, arranged when they were just 15 and 10 years old. Yet they spent 36 years together. Eleanor bore him 16 children and even accompanied him on crusades, living in tents in the desert. When she passed away in the north of England, the stern king was shattered. He transported her body to London, and at every stop along the way, he ordered the erection of a massive stone cross. There were 12 crosses for Eleanor. The famous Charing Cross in London marks the site of the last one. The king wrote to the abbot, quote 28, quote, "These words are not mere contractual phrases, they are a cry of loss." We often underestimate the emotional intelligence of our ancestors. We assume that because they didn't write lengthy posts about their feelings, they must have been emotionally blunt. But take a moment to read the book by Sir de la Tour, written in the 10th century for his daughters. He teaches them not only manners, but also how to recognize true feelings. He shares stories of couples who lived in great joy and harmony. The very word, quote, _29_ or agreement, was synonymous with happiness, hearts beating in unison. Of course there was violence. There were unhappy women locked in towers and men who despised their wives. But isn't that still true today, in an era of complete freedom of choice? The statistics on divorce and domestic violence in the 21st century suggest that the freedom to choose a partner does not guarantee happiness. Medieval people were more honest than we are. They didn't expect marriage to be a perpetual celebration. They understood that marriage required hard work, patience, and humility. That's why, when love ignited in such unions, it was incredibly resilient. It endured through plagues, wars, the loss of children, and decades of hard labour. There's a touching detail in the tombstones of that era. In England and France, hundreds of grave slabs remain where knights and their ladies are depicted lying side by side. Often, if you look closely, you can see them holding hands or gazing at one another. This was not a requirement of the canon. It demanded they look skyward, hands clasped in prayer. Joined hands were a personal request from the patron, a desire to convey to eternity. Quote, 30. We began this narrative with the assertion that there were no dates in the medieval world, and that holds true. They didn't experience a courtship period filled with gifts and flowers. They had no room for error. Their personal lives were open to relatives and clergy. Yet they possessed something we can learn from: the ability to value a person not for their beauty in a photograph, but for their reliability in times of trouble. They embraced fate and found joy in simple moments. They transformed someone chosen by their parents into their closest friend. The story of medieval love is not one of Romeo and Juliet, who perished without experiencing the mundane. It's the tale of thousands of nameless couples who survived, raised children, built homes, warmed each other during cold winters, and held hands in the face of death. Perhaps it is this quiet, unassuming, yet unbreakable love that has allowed humanity to endure until today. And so, we close our exploration of medieval relationships. The world has changed. We have become freer, purer, and wealthier. Yet each time we slip a ring onto a finger, ask for a bride's hand, or promise to stand together in joy and sorrow, we unknowingly echo the words and gestures of those who lived 800 years ago. Those who sought warmth in the same way as when we ask for a bride's hand, or vow to stand together through thick and thin. We unknowingly echo the words and gestures of those who lived 800 years ago. They too sought warmth and connection in the same way. You've been watching. Thanks for watching and have a great day.